Hello, it's Monday, and you know what that means. Time for another episode of RUNTALK. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. On today's episode, which is our 18th, woo-woo, I'm going to do something a little bit different. On all the other episodes, we have been selecting one specific topic and going deep. Today, we're going to talk about many different topics and go wide. And so I wanted to spend the day today talking about a lot of myths. You know, if you listen to social media, you know, that's where everyone's eyeballs are these days. So if you listen to the people on social media, or you read magazines or read articles online, there's a lot of myths when it comes to the running and the fitness industry. We'll focus more on running. To maybe another episode we'll talk about fitness in general, but for this episode we'll stay specific to running. That there's a lot of myths, there's a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of misconception. So I wanted to spend today's episode talking about running myths, misconceptions, and misinformation. So for a long time I've been interested in this subject because there's a lot of things that people discuss and spread around that gives people a lot of misinformation. And I'm reminded of the question I was asked a long time ago when I was a student. Was how do we know what we know? You know, how do we come to know the things that we know? Is it because we read it on social media? Is it because our great-grandmother told us in her wisdom? You know, is it because we read it in a book somewhere? You know, I recently had a quick conversation with someone on Instagram who I saw she posted something about muscle fiber types and the quadriceps versus the glutes, and I asked her, well, how do you know that? You know, where did you read that? Where did you come to learn that? And because it was inaccurate, and so I just asked her, well, where did you get that information from? And she said, oh, I read it in a couple of running books. And it's like, this is what people think. You know, they just read something in passing and they think it's the truth without really knowing themselves. And so that's why I think it's so important from once in a while to actually review some of the myths and misconceptions and misinformation that seems to be perpetuated a lot. And so I thought I would devote an entire episode to that. And so always ask yourself, you know, when you think you know something, ask yourself, well, how do I know this? How do I know what I know? And I'll tell you a quick story before we get into some of these myths. That when I was about 22, 23 years old, I was sitting in my graduate advisor's office when I was working on my master's degree at the University of Calgary. And one of the reasons I went to the University of Calgary was because they're one of the top schools in the world for exercise and sports science, specifically for biomechanics and for exercise physiology. And my advisor was Walter Herzog. If you don't know who Walter Herzog is, you should look him up. He's one of the top people in the world of biomechanics. And he's a very prolific researcher. He's done a lot of great work. He even won the top award in the field of biomechanics a few years after I graduated. I can't take credit for that, being his student. But Walter Herzog is the bomb. I mean, he's one of the smartest people I've ever met. He has an engineering background and a PhD in biomechanics, and he's from Switzerland. He is at the University of Calgary. He's been there a long time. And anyway, I digress. So I was sitting in his office when I was 22, 23 years old, and I was so impressed with his understanding and his ability to develop his own ideas, specifically about muscle mechanics. The area of research that he is specialized in is muscle mechanics, muscle force production, and that was the research that we did together when I was working my master's degree. And I was so impressed with his ability to come up with his own hypotheses, his own ideas about how muscles work and why they work the way they do. And I once asked him, how do you go from having a lot of knowledge to being able to come up with your own ideas? And without hesitation, he said to me, years of research. And it wasn't until years later, when I was pursuing my own research as part of my own PhD, that I understood what he meant. That when you carry out experiments in the laboratory year after year, and you hypothesize and you test those hypotheses, from many experiments, many years of doing that, you start to develop a true understanding of why things are the way they are, how things work, and you get to the point where you can develop your own ideas about things. And that's empowering. And so when I hear a lot of people talk about, this and that in the running world and the running community, and I always ask myself, well, how do they know that? How did they come to understand that? And I always reflect back on my own understanding of things, because I'm not perfect. I'm still learning every single day. I read constantly, all the reading I do for the books that I write. And when you write, that really forces you to really understand things and develop your own ideas about things. And like right now, I'm writing a whole book about training theories for runners and periodization, different models of how to set up the training throughout the year. And I'm interjecting my own ideas about how things should be done and why they should be done in a certain way. And the only reason I'm able to do that is because of how much I have immersed myself in this field ever since I was a kid. And so anyway, I wanted to share that story with you because I think it's interesting as to how we come to know what we know and how much we're willing to question what we know. And so with that as a background, I wanted to go over some of these myths and misconceptions and misinformation about running. And so I have some stuff on my screen here because I want to remind myself about, almost always, I don't have, like I've said before, I never have a teleprompter when I'm doing these RUNTALK shows. But sometimes I want to remind myself of things I want to say so I don't forget. And so, I'm going to glance a little bit at my screen here to remind myself of what I want to say. So the first myth I want to talk about, which may be the biggest myth about running, is that running is bad for your knees. Everyone has heard this before. And my entire running life, I've always had, people will always generate comments and they always say to me, well, how are your knees? How are you able to run all these years and have bad knees? Or they say to me that I can't run because I have bad knees. And I always feel like I have to stop them when they say that and give them, what the truth is, because I don't want people walking around thinking that running is bad for your knees. And that may be the biggest myth about running. Running is actually not bad for your knees, and in fact, the research shows just the opposite. That, the research shows two things: that people who don't run have no greater or no less incidence, or let me say it the other way: people who run have no greater incidence of joint degeneration or osteoarthritis compared to people who do run. And so there's a big myth that people think that because when you run there's a lot of pounding on the pavement that it must somehow be bad for your knees. But the research shows just the opposite. That the second thing the research shows is that when you run, because you're training the muscles around the knee, that you have all the support around the knee. So running can actually be good for your knees because it strengthens the musculature that surrounds the knee and so offers more stability to the knee joint itself. And so running is not only not bad for your knees, it may actually be good for your knees. The only reason why people who run have knee problems is because they must have some genetic predisposition to having joint degeneration or osteoarthritis. And so if your parents, for example, if your parents have had knee replacements, or even if one of your parents have had knee issues and had a knee replacement or some other kind of knee issue, then that puts you at a genetic predisposition for that. And running may bring that genetic predisposition to the forefront. That's quite possible because there is extra stress on the joints when you run. But running in and of itself is not bad for your knees. There may be some underlying latent problem that if you add the stress of running to that, it may bring that latent problem to the forefront and then it becomes a visible problem. But running in itself is not bad for your knees. There is no evidence at all throughout the large scientific body of research. There is no evidence that running in and of itself is bad for your knees. The other way you can look at it is, there's a lot of research to show and support that humans evolved to run. It's not that hard to go back into the research on evolution and why we are designed the way we are and why we function the way we do. It's very easy to dig up that research and to come to the conclusion that we literally were born to run. And so if you read some evolution, you understand that evolution has no foresight. We don't acquire certain traits for their future utility. The way evolution works is that there is a genetic random mutation of a gene. We have some random mutation of a gene, And if that mutation confers some advantage to us at that present moment, then that mutation sticks around because it has conferred an advantage to our survival as a species. And so that mutation will stick around for the next generation, and the next generation, and the next generation. So evolution, the way we are what we are, which is hard to believe, is that we are a series of random genetic mutations. Now, of course, this is in some conflict with my beliefs about God and how we got here, and that's a whole other talk. But this is a monumental day for Judaism, because this is the biggest holiday right now that we are serving. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and so I'm always in conflict with this issue of how we got here. Did God just plop us here, or are we just a series of random mutations of genes, or is it a merging of the two? And that is quite possible that God has set up evolution to occur. Anyway, that's another talk for the day. I digress a lot on RUNTALK because I think about things as I say them. Anyway, let's get back to the knee issue. And so you could ask yourself, well, why would evolution have created an ability for us to do something that is harmful? Why would we have evolved to be able to run so successfully if running was harmful to our bodies? That's not the way evolution would work. Evolution works in such a way that the abilities that we acquire they confer some advantage to our survival. They don't harm us. Otherwise, if it was bad for us, then we would have lost that ability a long time ago. So the fact that we are able to run from an evolutionary perspective is also support that running is not bad for your knees. Because if it were, then if it were injurious to us and it would hurt ourselves, we would have lost that ability a long time ago. So that's the first myth. That running is not bad for your knees. So the next time anybody ever says to you running is bad for your knees, make sure that you chime in and tell them the truth. That there is no scientific evidence or evolutionary evidence that running hurts our knees. So that's number one. I want to clear that up. Running is not bad for your knees. The second myth, or more of a misconception, is that, and I love this one because it gets into the training aspect, is that runners race faster by practicing to run faster, by training faster. A lot of runners think that if I want to get faster in a race, that I must run faster in practice and training. And that's not really how distance running works. That's how sprinting works. Power type sports, that's how it works. But distance running, that's not how it works. The way you become better as a distance runner is to cause specific physiological adaptations that enable you to run faster in the future, enable you to hold a faster pace in the future. And for this misconception, I will tell the story of I Love Lucy. It really all comes back to I Love Lucy. Some of you who are watching, you may be familiar with the story of I Love Lucy. And there's a famous episode of I Love Lucy. It's the famous chocolate episode. Maybe you remember it, maybe you're familiar with it. Lucy and Ethel are working in a chocolate factory. And at first, the conveyor belt is coming down very slowly. And their job, Lucy and Ethel's job, is to pick up the chocolates from the conveyor belt and wrap it and put it back on the conveyor belt so it gets sent on its way to the end of the conveyor belt. So at first they have no problem handling the job because the conveyor belt is moving slowly. And it's easy for them to pick up the chocolate, they wrap the chocolate, they put it back down, it goes on its way. And then the operator of the conveyor belt starts to increase the speed of the conveyor belt. And it gets to a point where the speed is so fast that it becomes a hilarious moment in TV history because Lucy and Ethel can't keep up with the movement of the chocolates down the conveyor belt. So they end up picking it up and they're shoving it in their mouths, they're wearing these fancy hats, they shove it in their hats, they shove it in their clothes, they're sticking it in there trying to eat some of the chocolates. They can't pick up the chocolate, wrap it, and put it down fast enough. Whoever directed that scene of I Love Lucy had no idea that he was giving away the secret to how to become a better distance runner. Because that's exactly what a lot of distance runners try to do. They try to keep running faster in training. They try to keep speeding up the conveyor belt in hopes that they will produce more chocolates more quickly, in hopes that they will be able to run faster in a race. But what would be the better way for Lucy and Ethel to be able to wrap more chocolates? Is it to speed up the one conveyor belt, as what happened in the TV episode? Or is it to create multiple conveyor belts all working at the same pace? Obviously, the answer is the latter. And that's what we do with training. You can think of the conveyor belts as the mitochondria. The mitochondria are the aerobic factories. That's where aerobic metabolism takes place. So the Lucy and Ethel, the conveyor belt, and in the factory that they're working in, you can think of that as the mitochondria. And the Lucys and Ethels are the enzymes, the workers inside of the mitochondria. The enzymes catalyze metabolic reactions. The more enzymes we have, the faster metabolic reactions occur, and the faster we produce energy, the chocolates, for muscle contraction. And so rather than trying to constantly push by increasing the speed of the conveyor belt, the more elegant strategy to become a better runner is to create more conveyor belts, create more enzymes, create more Lucys and Ethels. And we do that by doing more volume at the correct pace. So whatever type of workout you're doing, whether it's lactate threshold workout or a VO2 max workout, if you do more volume over time, and also just the regular mileage, that's one of the main reasons why you run high mileage, to become a good runner, to create more mitochondria, to create more aerobic enzymes, to become a more economical runner. And so if we do more volume over time at the correct pace, then we increase the number of mitochondria we have, we increase the number of enzymes, the Lucys and Ethels we have, and then we can produce more ATP, we can produce more chocolates at the end of all those multiple conveyor belts, instead of trying to constantly hammer the one conveyor belt by going faster and faster and faster down the one assembly line. We create multiple assembly lines all working at the same speed. And so, to get back to the myth, distance runners don't get faster by training faster in practice. You get faster by doing more volume at the right speeds to create more assembly lines, more conveyor belts. Another myth number 3, lungs limit running performance. A lot of people think that they're out of breath, that their lungs are what's limiting their ability to run faster. At sea level, your blood oxygen saturation, which is really what matters for oxygen transport, is nearly 100%. We breathe air in, and we take it inside of our lungs, and it gets into the alveoli of the lungs, the little sacs that look like little Brussels sprouts. They look like, or broccoli. They look more like broccoli. They look broccoli with a little head, and there's like little nodules on it, and you spread all that out, and it adds up to a large surface area. But the reason these sacs are so crumpled together is so that we can have a large surface area in a very small space inside of our chest cavity. And so inside the alveoli, we have the oxygen, and that eventually goes into the bloodstream through the pulmonary capillaries, and then eventually the arterial system, and gets transported throughout our body to all of our cells that need it, including the muscle fibers, so that we can hold a certain pace. And so we have plenty of oxygen in our lungs and in our blood. Even when you're running really fast, your blood oxygen saturation at sea level is about 98%. It reduces a little bit from 100% as we go from the lungs into the arterial system. So, if you ever go to a hospital, they put that little clip on your finger, it estimates blood oxygen saturation. At sea level, it's around 98%. And even when you're running as fast as you can, it'll stay at about 98%. And so, taking deeper breaths to get in more oxygen, that's useless, because the blood oxygen saturation is already close to 100% at sea level. It'll reduce a little bit as you go up to high altitude, but still, taking in more oxygen through breathing is not what's limiting your performance. If we want to get more oxygen to where it needs to go, how do we do that? We increase our cardiovascular output from the heart, cardiac output. We increase our stroke volume, we increase our heart rate, and you multiply those two things together, stroke volume times heart rate, we get cardiac output. So it's a cardiovascular responsibility to get more blood and more oxygen where it has to go. Your lungs are not what's limiting your performance, because number one, the lungs are not really trainable the way we can train our heart, the way we can train our muscular system. the lungs aren't really trainable, and the lungs are really just the storage site, if you will, for the gas transfer, oxygen and carbon dioxide. We have to go through some medium. We go through the lungs. So the lungs, that's how we get in oxygen, and then it gets transported into the cardiovascular system and through the arterial system. And the same thing with carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide we expel out. The reason why you're out of breath and you feel like your breathing is limiting you is because when you run, you produce carbon dioxide, and you have to breathe more to breathe out that carbon dioxide. The partial pressure, the PCO2, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood, is the main stimulus to breathe at sea level. When you go up to higher altitude, then it becomes a combination of the PCO2, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and the PO2, the partial pressure of oxygen. But at sea level, the main stimulus to breathe is because of the need to exhale the carbon dioxide. And so when you're running along and you feel this need to breathe heavy, it's because of the CO2 that has been produced because of the reactions in metabolism. And so the way to solve that problem is to become more aerobically fit, and then you can run at a faster pace before you accumulate CO2 and before you have to then breathe heavily. And so that's why very fit runners, when they're running even at 6-minute pace, they're not breathing that hard because it's still aerobic for them. They would have to run at 5:30 pace for it to become slightly anaerobic, and then they produce a lot of CO2, and then they have to breathe more. And so the reason you breathe more is because you're already producing CO2 at the pace that you're running. And the way to alleviate that is to become fitter so that you have to run at a faster pace before you start to introduce some anaerobic metabolism. And then the CO2 will be produced, and then you'll have to breathe more at that faster pace. And so breathing in and of itself is not what's limiting your performance. You have a great capacity to expand your breathing. That's not what's limiting. In the most trained, most genetically gifted runners, the most elite, they have what's called an expiratory flow limitation. This was one of the things I studied for my doctoral dissertation. It was looking at expiratory flow, which means that they are breathing at the fastest rate at which they can. And because of that, they are limiting. You could argue that their breathing is limiting in their sense, in their elite sense, because they are transferring airflow as fast as they possibly can. Whereas everybody else, they have a window where they can expand their breathing even more. Whereas at the very elite level, they are encroaching upon the maximal rate at which airflow can be generated. And so it can be argued by myself as well as respiratory physiologists who are much more well known in this than I am. But I've read all their work, especially when I was working on my PhD dissertation, that in the most elite runners, then you could argue that they are somewhat limited by the lungs because they are already encroaching upon the lungs' maximum ability to generate airflow through the lungs. But in everybody else, the lungs don't limit running performance. So let's clear that up. The lungs do not limit, even though you may feel that the lungs are limiting. The lungs are not what's limiting your running performance. It's either a metabolic issue in the muscles or a cardiovascular issue, or could be, if you're running in the heat, it could be a thermoregulatory issue. But it's the reason why you feel out of breath, it's not because of what's happening in the lungs. It's not because your lungs are not limiting your running performance. Another big myth is about lactic acid. We hear this all the time. The lactic acid causes fatigue, muscle burning, and muscle soreness. And so a long time ago, in 1780 is when lactic acid was discovered. It was discovered in sour milk. If you leave milk out, it'll ferment. It goes through glycolysis because there is sugar in the milk. So we break down the sugar in the milk through glycolysis, and we ultimately produce lactic acid if that milk is left to spoil. And so this was discovered a long time ago, 1780. And so lactic acid is produced in a metabolic pathway called glycolysis, which is literally the breaking down of sugar. And in the 1920s, there were two Nobel Prize winners, A.V. Hill and Otto Meyerhoff, and they discovered, they took a frog sartorius muscle. They plucked out muscle fibers from the frog sartorius, which is the longest muscle in the body. It transverses the quadriceps. It sits on top of the quadriceps. The longest muscle in the body is your sartorius muscle. It sits on top of the quadriceps. And they noticed they put a force transducer on each end of the sartorius, and they will electrically stimulate it and chart the force production. They kept electrically stimulating it until the force would start to decrease. And what they noticed was that when force production decreased inside this frog's sartorius muscle, that it happened in the absence of oxygen, and what do you know, lactic acid was produced. And so they linked all these things together, and they thought that, they hypothesized that lactic acid was produced in the absence of oxygen, and that's what must cause fatigue. And these were two smart guys. They were Nobel Prize winners. But they were wrong. Just because two things happen at the same time does not imply cause and effect. There's a relationship there, but it's not a causative one. And now we know many years later that lactic acid, or the way it's produced inside of our bodies at our physiological pH, it actually exists as lactate, not as lactic acid. It's not in its acid form. And so lactate, we now know many years later, that lactate does not cause fatigue. In fact, lactate is extremely important, and it must be produced to stimulate glycolysis to continue to occur. Lactate is also used as a fuel by the heart, and is used by the liver to create new glucose through gluconeogenesis, the formation of new glucose from things that are not. And so lactate is actually extremely important. We need to produce lactate for many different reasons. It has nothing to do with fatigue. But concomitant with lactate production, we also accumulate a lot of other metabolites, hydrogen ions being one of those metabolites. And it's the increase in hydrogen ion production that causes fatigue, because that lowers the pH that causes acidosis, as we all learned about in high school chemistry class, when we took litmus paper and we dipped it in different acids and different bases, and the litmus paper changed color, and we were measuring the pH. That H in pH is the hydrogen ion concentration. When hydrogen ion concentration increases because of reactions in metabolism and because of the breaking apart of ATP inside muscle, the ATP hydrolysis, we accumulate a lot of hydrogen ions. And it's that increase in hydrogen ion production that causes a drop in the pH, and the muscles become a little bit more acidic. We call that acidosis. And that's one major thing that causes fatigue. Acidosis inhibits enzyme function. Remember before when I was talking about leucine ethyl, and they're the enzymes inside the factory of mitochondria? Acidosis inhibits enzyme function. If we inhibit the rate at which enzymes work, at the rate at which they catalyze metabolic reactions, then we slow down metabolism. We slow down the rate at which we produce ATP, energy for muscle contraction. And the way we see that is that the pace slows down because we reduce the amount of force production against the ground. That's how scientists define fatigue, is a decrease in muscle force production. The way us runners see that is the pace is slowing down. We can't hold the pace anymore. And the reason we can't hold the pace anymore is because our muscles aren't producing as much force against the ground. We have decreased muscle force production. And so lactic acid, or lactate, the way it occurs inside of our body, is not what's causing the fatigue. We have other metabolites, hydrogen ion production. We also increase phosphate production. Inorganic phosphate gets produced because we have the breaking apart of ATP inside muscle, which produces phosphate and ADP, adenosine diphosphate. And so when we break apart ATP quickly because we're running faster, then we also produce the two constituents of ATP, ADP and phosphate. And phosphate also decreases muscle force production. We also get an increase in potassium ions, which also decreases muscle force production. And that has to do with the sodium-potassium pump. And if you're familiar with how muscles contract, there's electrochemical gradient between sodium and potassium. Sodium rushes inside the muscle membrane, potassium rushes outside, and we end up with a lot of potassium on the outside of the muscle membrane. And that also exerts an influence on muscle force production in a different way than the acidosis, but the end result is that we still decrease muscle force production. So the point here is that lactate does not cause fatigue. But at the same time that lactate accumulates inside the muscles and inside the blood, we get other metabolites. We get hydrogen ions, we get potassium, we get phosphate, and those three other metabolites, when they accumulate, they exert some different influence, which ultimately leads to a decrease in muscle force production and fatigue. The pace slows down. But lactate has nothing to do with fatigue. The other myth about lactic acid, is that it causes muscle burning. Lactate has nothing to do with muscle burning. You know how many times I have taken a blood sample from somebody in the laboratory that had a high blood lactate value, and I measured that? I have never burnt myself by taking somebody's blood lactate, even when it was very high. Lactate has nothing to do with that intense feeling that you feel inside your muscles, whether it's a burning feeling or some other kind of feeling. That intensity that we feel, that lactate has nothing to do with that. It may have to do with an increase in muscle temperature, which also happens when we run really fast, we work really hard. There's a slight increase in muscle temperature, and so that might be what you're sensing, but it has nothing to do with lactic acid. And so I remember when Jane Fonda used to ask her exercise video audience to feel the burn. Jane Fonda had no idea back then that it had nothing to do with lactate, but lactate is not what causes the muscle burn. Lactate also doesn't cause muscle soreness. That's the other myth about lactate. If you were to run as fast as you could and race 800 meters or race a mile, those are the races that have very high lactate values, 400 meters in track and field, 400, 800 mile races. Those are the long sprints or middle distance races. Those are the races that produce a lot of lactate. Even if you were to take a blood sample right after that, you'll see how high the lactate value is. If you were just to do nothing for 30 to 60 minutes and then take another blood lactate sample, you would find that lactate is back down to its normal resting value. So lactate does not cause muscle soreness. You get sore a day later. You feel the soreness a day later, even 2 days later, that delayed onset muscle soreness that people in the fitness industry talk about. DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. It's called that because it's delayed onset. You don't feel it immediately. If you were to go run a marathon, you might feel sore an hour or two later, but certainly a day later you'll really feel it. It's because of the microscopic damage that you have inside your muscle fibers. When you do a hard workout or you do a very long workout, something that you're not used to doing, there's little microscopic damage to those muscle fibers. You have to look at it under a microscope to see it. And anytime you have some kind of trauma inside your body, you have this inflammatory response, and you have this influx of white blood cells into the area to start the healing process. And so we get the inflammation, and it's that inflammation that we sense. That's what we feel. That soreness comes from the inflammation, and that inflammation comes from this slight damage that you have done to your muscle fibers, which they need to heal, and they heal back stronger more resilient than they were before. And that's the whole training process. The breaking down, the building up, the breaking down, the building up. That's the whole process of training. And so lactate is long gone outside of the muscle by the time you feel sore. And so you don't feel sore because of the lactic acid, the lactate. That has nothing to do with it. You feel sore because of the inflammation that is due to the muscle fiber damage. And so I wanted to clear. So those are the three myths about lactic acid. That it causes soreness, we know that's not true. It causes fatigue, that's not true. And you don't slow down while you're running a race or a workout because of lactic acid. That has nothing to do with it. So lactic acid doesn't cause fatigue, and it doesn't have any ramifications that are negative inside of your body. Lactic acid is actually an important thing. Okay, so let's talk about another misinformation. Strength training will make you a better distance runner. Oh, I love this one. Because if you listen to social media, you see people doing their body weight exercises and pushing that off as strength training for runners. Yeah, if you do some lunges and you do some squats or you do some glute bridges, it's going to make you a better runner. That's a bunch of baloney. That's a huge misinformation in this industry, is that strength training will make you a better runner. There's very little scientific evidence that strength training will make you a better runner. The only scientific evidence that strength training can help make you a better runner is if you do very, very, very heavy strength training that focuses on muscle fiber recruitment, the neural aspect of strength. So you don't want to strength train to increase muscle size, hypertrophy. That would actually hurt running performance because it costs more oxygen to transport a heavier weight. Even if that heavier weight is muscle rather than fat, it costs more oxygen to transport that heavier weight, and that refers to your economy. Your running economy is how much oxygen you consume to maintain a given speed. And so if you ever notice, the best runners in the world have very thin legs with not a lot of muscle mass. And there's a reason for that. Because it takes more oxygen. The heavier your leg is, it takes more oxygen to pick that leg up and put it down and pick it up and put it down and pick it up and put it down. You want to have as little muscle mass on your legs as possible. And so if you're going to strength train, you have to lift very heavy weights with very few reps per set, like 3 reps per set at something greater than 90% of your 1 rep max, which is the max amount of weight you can lift one time. You want to lift very close to that 1 rep max and only do a few reps in each set so that you don't have a lot of protein degradation inside your muscles and then get a lot of protein synthesis. You don't want that. You want to focus on the neural aspect of strength, how your brain, how your central nervous system recruits muscle fibers quickly to produce force. And that requires very, very heavy strength training with very few reps per set and very few sets to focus on the ability to recruit fibers quickly. And so that's the only kind of strength training that has some validity, that it will improve running economy through a neural mechanism. But even with those studies, there are very few studies that have actually shown that strength training makes you a faster runner. There are studies to show that heavy strength training or plyometrics that are not heavy but that produce force quickly against the ground can help improve running economy. But there are very few studies that have actually shown that that translates into running a faster race. There are very few studies that have actually looked at running performance, whether it's a 5K race or a marathon race. There's absolutely no research on marathon or half marathon. All of the research that has measured performance because of heavy strength training or plyometrics is on much shorter type races or time trials that they'll use, and they'll use some kind of laboratory performance test. There's no studies really that have actually sent people out into a race in the real world and actually see that the strength training makes somebody run a faster race. There's no research on that because that's very hard to control, and scientists like to control things, so they'll do like some kind of a performance test in a lab. So strength training really should play a secondary supportive role, if any role at all. The primary goal to become a better distance runner is to focus on the running training first. The volume, the intensity, the volume of intensity. Once you have maxed out all of that, if there's something that you still have energy to do, then you can focus on very specific strength training. But I would first maximize everything else. And if you want to do strength training, you could argue that running up a hill, doing bounding drills up a hill, or doing hill sprints, that is much better strength training for a runner than doing a wall squat or doing clamshells on the ground or doing glute bridges. How is that stuff going to help you hold a faster pace? There's no relationship between doing glute bridges with your back on the ground and holding a faster pace in a marathon. There is no relationship there. To think that that would help you is ludicrous. If you want to strength train to be a better runner, it has to be done in a very specific way. Unilaterally, on one leg at a time, because when you run, you're producing force against the ground one leg at a time. And it has to be very, very heavy strength training that focuses on your central nervous system's ability to recruit muscle fibers quickly to produce force. And that's more of the power type strength training. So that kind of strength training has some merit. But I wouldn't do that until you have maximized all the running training. And so the point that I really want to make here is that, if you have a choice to make, if you're running, say, 30 miles a week, and you have a choice, do I take some extra time to stay at 30 miles a week and add strength training into my training program? Or do I take the extra time that I have and go from 30 miles a week to 40 miles a week? Which do you think is going to have the much greater impact on your running performance? You're right, obviously the latter, going from 30 miles a week to 40 miles a week, rather than staying at 30 and using the time to strength train. We all only have a certain amount of time, and so you have to ask yourself, where is your time best well spent? You also have to ask yourself, what volume of training is going to cause me to get injured. Because if you did run 40 miles a week and that caused you to get injured, well then yes, it would be better to stay at 30 miles a week and do the strength training instead. Because if 30 miles a week going to 40 miles a week causes you to get injured, well then obviously that's not going to be good for your running performance. Who wants to get injured? And so you have to ask yourself, what's the max amount of running I can do and not get injured, and continue to adapt to it so that I can become a better runner? And what kind of support can strength training play, if at all, if I have the time to do that? You know, if you want to become a really good runner and you're running a lot of miles per week, then you could easily make the argument, as I have made many times in my talks around the world and in all my writings, that if you're running 80 miles a week, 90 miles a week, and you're going to try to strength train on top of that, the strength training is only going to hurt you because it's going to cause more fatigue. If you're doing a lot of running, how can you run 70, 80, 90 miles a week, including hard workouts like long tempo runs and very long runs and interval workouts? If you're doing all that in the context of 80 miles a week and you're going to strength train on top of that, all you're going to be doing is just adding fatigue on top of fatigue. And that's actually going to hurt your running performance, because recovery, as I've talked about many times before, recovery is integral to adaptation. And so if you strength train on top of doing a lot of running, all you're going to do is detract from your ability to recover, and that's only going to hurt your running performance, not help it. So you have to consider all these things. So strength training is not necessary unless you have already maximized your running training by increasing the volume and the intensity and the volume of intensity. It's not necessary unless you cannot physically handle more running, as I just mentioned, that if you ran more you would get injured. Well, you don't want to do that. So strength training is not necessary unless you can't handle more running physically. Strength training is not necessary unless you have already reached your genetic potential to the running training. If you have already done so much that you've already reached your genetic potential and there's still something more that you want to do to improve your running, okay, then I could argue that you can integrate strength training. Or if you have some documented muscle strength imbalance that, if not corrected, you would get yourself injured, then strength training can be necessary. If you have some documented strength deficiency, like you went to a physical therapist, they measured muscle strength in the different muscle groups, and they compared it to normative data, and they see that, oh yeah, you're weak in your hamstrings compared to the rest of the population of runners, then you might need to do some isolated strength training to improve the strength of that particular muscle group so that you don't get injured when you do all the running. So except for those few conditions, strength training is not really necessary. And so that's a big misunderstanding, it's a big misconception of running performance. People on social media act like strength training is vital. It's not vital. So I wanted to clear that up. Another misinformation: girls have greater risk of injury than boys. Unless a female runner is losing her menstrual cycle, which happens a lot with female runners because of the low percentage of body fat that is mostly triggered by inadequate caloric intake, not so much by the running volume. People can handle large volumes of running, but you have to make sure that you consume enough calories to meet the energetic demand that you are putting on your body through all that running. So unless a female is losing her menstrual cycle, that would be the one thing that puts a female runner at greater risk compared to a male runner for injuries. Other than that, if a woman has a normal menstruation, then she is at no greater risk of injury, of a running-related injury, compared to a male runner. So that's big misinformation. That females are at no greater risk than males unless they lose their menstrual cycle, which then affects estrogen, and estrogen has a protective effect on bone. Estrogen has the biggest impact on bone health than anything else, and so under conditions of low estrogen, so you can also say pre-puberty or post-menopause, those would also be conditions of low estrogen, and then a female runner would be at a greater risk of injury compared to males, at least as it pertains to bone injuries. Another myth: stretching prevents injuries, reduces soreness, and improves performance. Back when I was in middle school and high school, my phys ed teacher, we always had the class stretch before class, and before we were going to do whatever activity we were going to do that day. And there is no evidence that stretching reduces the risk of injury or improves performance or reduces soreness. As we mentioned before, soreness comes from the microscopic damage that you have to muscle tissue. Stretching is not going to reduce that muscle soreness. Only the healing of those muscle fibers is going to reduce the soreness. And for the inflammation to subside, that's what's going to reduce the soreness. Stretching is not going to reduce soreness. If you were to go run a race, and if you stretched, 20 minutes before the race, you're not going to run the race any faster. Stretching has no impact on your running performance. It doesn't make you run faster just because you stretched a few minutes before the workout or a few minutes before your race. And it also doesn't prevent injuries, especially the running types of injuries that people get. The research shows that only ballistic kinds of training, the injuries that are caused because of ballistic movements like volleyball players or basketball players who need compliant tendons, that stretching may have an ability to reduce injuries in those kinds of sports. But in the more cyclical kinds of sports like swimming and cycling and running, stretching does not impact or reduce those kinds of injuries that runners get. Misinformation. Runners need to eat carbs before races. The only kind of a race in which you would need to increase your amount of carbohydrate is a marathon, which puts a drain on muscle carbohydrate, muscle glycogen. All other races, you have plenty of carbohydrate inside your muscle. Unless you eat a low-carb diet, that's a whole other issue. You should be eating a low-carb diet if you want to become a better runner. But unless you're on a very low-carb diet, then that will impact your running performance, especially high-intensity workouts, which demand carbohydrate. They need carbohydrate. But for all of the races, a mile, 800 meters, 5K, 10K, even a half marathon, and most people, you already have enough stored carbohydrate to get yourself through the race. The marathon, one of the things that makes the marathon, especially the ultra marathon, unique, is that the race is long enough that we deplete our muscle store of carbohydrate. In most people, you have enough stored carbohydrate, assuming that you eat a normal carbohydrate diet, then you have enough stored carbohydrate to last in excess of 2 hours of sustained, moderate intensity exercise. So any race that is less time than that, you have enough stored carbohydrate to get yourself through the race. So you don't need to carbo load the night before. I remember when I was at high school, before cross-country races, we would go over to somebody's house on the team, and the parents would make carbohydrate. We would make pasta. And we'd have a pasta party. High school runners love to have their cross-country high school pasta parties. But you don't need to do that to race a 5K. It's not going to make a difference because you already have enough carbohydrate in your muscles to get through the 5K. Misconception. Don't run if you're sick. There's actually an interesting relationship between exercise and the immune system. There's a J-shaped relationship. That no exercise and a lot of exercise is bad for the immune system. But there's this sweet spot in the middle. So it looks like a J. If you were to plot this, it looks like a J. That if you don't exercise at all, you have an increased risk for upper respiratory tract infection, or URTI, upper respiratory tract infection, or the common cold, or getting any other kind of respiratory disease, like pneumonia or bronchitis or anything. You do have a slight increased risk if you're sedentary and you don't exercise. Then we go through the J, so the bottom part of the J, your risk for an upper respiratory tract infection is reduced with exercise. It's reduced a lot. And then we increase, so here's the J, we increase the J at very high levels of exercise, like running many marathons or ultra marathons or running 100 miles a week. At very high levels of exercise, you also have an increased risk. A lot of people, they know that right after they run a marathon, that they're susceptible to catching a cold or getting sick because you have depressed the immune system. So at no exercise at all, you have an increased risk. At modest levels of exercise, you have a reduced risk of getting sick. And at very, very high levels of exercise, you also have an increased risk of getting sick. But at modest levels of exercise, which is what most of the population does, then you actually have a reduced risk of getting sick. We hear this a lot now with COVID, that if you exercise, you will have less of a risk of catching a respiratory virus because you have improved the quality of the immune system. You have strengthened the immune system through exercise. David Neiman is one of the top researchers in the world he used to be at Appalachian State University in North Carolina. I forget where he is now. I think he still might be in North Carolina. I'm not sure where he is now. But David Neiman is one of the top researchers in the world on exercise and the immune system. So read his research. Fantastic body of research on looking at how exercise affects the immune system. So as a guideline, if your symptoms are above the neck, then it's okay to run. Like if you have a cold and it's all in your nose and you just have congestion and maybe you have a headache or something, or you feel pressure in your head, as long as the symptoms are above your neck, it's okay to run. But if your symptoms are below the neck, if you have a cough that is in your chest, or if you have fever, then it is not okay to run. Then you're going to hurt yourself. You're going to do more damage than good. So if the symptoms are above your neck, okay to run. If your symptoms are below your neck, in your chest, you feel that muscle achiness, you feel lethargic, you have a fever, then not okay to run until those symptoms subside. And then the final myth I want to discuss before we leave for the day. Myth, you have to run a lot to be a good runner. Okay, I lied. This one is true. You do have to run a lot to be a good runner. Ha ha, I fooled you. I have to have some fun when I'm talking to myself on social media. And so I wanted to finish with that one. That yes, you do, that myth is true. You do have to run a lot to be a good runner. That is perhaps the single biggest lesson about being a good runner, is you got to run a lot. You got to run a lot of miles per week. Even for the middle distances, like 800 meters and mile races, in high school, and I used to run that. Even for those short races, you got to run a lot to be a good runner. Even the best middle distance runners in the world still run 60, 70, 80 miles a week, even though their race is only 1 mile long. So you still have to run a lot to be a good runner. For my final thought, I finish each episode of Run Talk with a thought. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, today is a big Jewish holiday. I shouldn't even be doing my Run Talk. I'm not supposed to be working on today, but I want to still to share this with you. And so for this final thought that I want to leave you with, I want to tie it into what this holiday is all about. Because even though it's Jews have a lot of traditions and a lot of symbolism. The whole Jewish tradition is about symbolism and tradition, but it pertains to all kinds of religions. Everyone can relate to this. Is that today is about atoning for our sins and being reflective. And I get emotional when I talk about this stuff. It's about trying to be a better person in the year ahead. And I noticed over the years that is something that running has also given me and gives to a lot of people. This chance to, when we run, to reflect on who we are and use our running to try to become better tomorrow than we are today. And so on this Day of Atonement, in Hebrew we call it Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, I'm not running because I'm fasting. Again, another symbolic gesture that Jews make is that to cleanse ourselves of our sins. We don't eat the whole day. We don't drink. We don't eat. And so if I sound a little loopy, it's because I haven't eaten since dinner last night. But use your run. That's a lesson I want to provide and leave you with. The thought that I want to leave you with is to use your running as a chance to reflect on your actions from the previous year or even the previous day and who you are, and use your running to narrow the gap between who you are and who you want to be. I talk about this all the time. I wrote about that in The Inner Runner. That was my favorite book to write, about using running to narrow the gap between who you are and who you want to be, and make a promise, whether it's to God, as Jews make that promise, or if you're not religious, make that promise to yourself, that you strive to be better tomorrow than you are today, and use those foot strikes against the ground. Use your running to realize that promise, to put forth the effort, because running is all about effort, the effort that you make in any given workout, in any given race, on any given run, and use your running to reflect about who you are, what you have done in the past, and who you want to be tomorrow and in this next year. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Run Talk. I hope you enjoyed it. Come back next Monday. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. Thank you very much.